Hello, my name is Angel Tapia, and I'm the Senior Manager of Hispanic Outreach at Global Healthy Living Foundation. Today, I'm joined by two amazing people. First, Samantha Ben, a licensed clinical social worker with a Master of Social Work from the University of Texas at Austin, with 7 years of psychotherapy practice, specializing in trauma and mental illness. Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My next guest is Felicia Tapia, who has a bachelor's degree in psychology and is currently pursuing a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, and is one of our GHLF summer interns, who, by the way, by her last name, you can also tell is part of my family tribe. Welcome, Felicia.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to just have this conversation really to provide some insight on the generational differences within the Hispanic and Latinx community. So I purposefully invited Felicia to be part of this conversation because I thought that it would be very enlightening to have us talk about some of our family experiences and realizing that they may look different because of our generational differences and also our countries of origin. And I invited Samantha Ben to join us because of her insight to this. I think it would be a great place for us to start conversation and really dive into some of those differences that we all may be experiencing, which also gives us some commonality as well. So I want to begin with a question that I've been asked a lot lately, which is, how do you ethnically identify? My answer to that has been that I'm Hispanic and I'm Afro-Latina. My culture is Hispanic. My race is Afro-Latina. And I think it's something that I didn't give too much thought to. I just thought, hey, I am Hispanic, I am Latina, I answer it to it all. But I know that that's a topic of conversation that's just very used, especially when we're surrounding ourselves with Hispanic Heritage Month. So I'd like to ask the two of you, how do you ethnically identify? Samantha, I'll start with you.
I think it's a great question because my identity has evolved as I've learned my personal history and my community's history. And so I identify as Latina and Indigenous.
Felicia, how do you identify?
I identify as a Black and white Hispanic.
So I think that when we look at the differences of how we identify, we still realize that we are part of this bigger picture, right? Our language, our heritage, and looking at the different descriptions that we could use, it's understandable that sometimes there is some confusion for those outside of our culture to maybe ask the questions, just because it is something that is personal based on so many different things. I think, obviously our background can also affect, how we identify within our families and our experiences as individuals in the US. So Samantha, what are ways that you have seen families affected by some of these differences between their culture and customs and fitting the mold in the United States?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's so complex because there are so many experiences, right? There's so much richness and variation in how we express ourselves depending on where we're from, how long we've been here. Things that influence the way that we identify, what words we choose for ourselves, and then also the experience that we have in this country, our language, right? Like, are we having to learn English? Do we speak multiple languages in the house? That can be really stressful to come here and feel like you have to learn English. There's a lot of pressure. A lot of people I've heard have to practice their accent away, right? And that is so damaging. Also, proximity to the generation that came to this country. If somebody in the lineage came to this country, was that you? Is that your parents? Because if so, then you likely grew up with a different set of values, right? That sometimes can be in conflict with American values. And so you'll have strong roots to maybe another country. Or even the way that your family came here or you came here can be really traumatic, right? Most of the time. Also, the part of the country that you're in when you come to the United States or the community that you find yourself in. If you're in an all-white community, it's likely you're going to feel othered, you're going to feel less than, You're going to feel isolated, ostracized. There's not going to be representation, right? Whereas if you are in a community that looks like you, that's brown, that, has culture, you might feel more proud. You might be able to express yourself. So there's so many things that impact how we identify, what our experience is.
Very true. And I think that you just hit the nail on the head, it depends also what community surrounds us, and how quickly we can assimilate within that community. That makes a huge difference in finding ourselves, fitting in much faster, because there's kind of a bridge. Those that have come before us that, maybe learning English and be a bit more advanced in the language and can help facilitate the assimilation versus in areas where you're a bit more isolated.
I have a question for you. Have you ever felt like you had to choose between your Hispanic identity and your American identity?
So I don't think I had to choose, but I think it was more of a challenge, like for my family members,
Yeah.
maybe, for my parents and my siblings, because they were all raised in the same way. Right. And then coming to the US, I was the youngest. So I had more Americanized customs. So the things that they felt I was getting away with or being spoiled was like, well, but this is the US. Like,
Right.
people do have friends call them on the phone, and maybe on a Saturday, like after I clean, I'm able to go out and hang out with friends that aren't necessarily just family members. So I think those were things that, like, my siblings felt didn't make a lot of sense, that my parents had a challenge with. But for me, it was just, I had this different world of opportunities that wasn't very common or socially acceptable to them. And they had to make the adaptation to allow me to have those experiences. So Samantha, considering your Hispanic clients, can you speak on some of the nuances, challenges, or opportunities that often come with being part of the Hispanic community in the US?
Yeah. That pressure to conform and assimilate, like you talked about, is it's kind of like the overarching thing, right? And so I work with people to try to find the balance of, like, how do you balance being bicultural, right? And living in a white dominated society where white people are centered. And so for each individual person and each individual family too, it's different, the way that we have to adapt to it and what we find that works for us, how we express ourselves, how much space we can take up, right? Or we want to take up. Some of the nuances, like I said, language, immigration, documentation status. When I was in grad school, we did a research study on Latina teenagers because they had the highest suicide attempt rates of all teenagers. And it was because of this issue, right? They would go to school, exactly what you talked about, Angel. Like, they would go to school. There's a heavy focus on friendship, on being social, on indulging in certain things. And then they would go home and the focus is on family, right? And needing to be with family and be in that family system and your role and maybe speak a different language, and them just experiencing so much mental anguish because they couldn't figure out, like, how do I get it right? Right? Like, how do I fit in? And show up well. And that's a lot of pressure when you're developing, right? When your brain is developing. And so it would lead to high suicide attempts. I also do want to mention queer and trans community. When we talk about in our culture and Latinx community, because depending on how religious our family is, a lot of times that's wrapped up in our culture too, the religion. And that leads to not accepting queer and trans Latinx family members.
And when you talk about those challenges, it is true that the experiences that we have with our peers are so influential at any age. And then when we put in the cultural differences or how we sexually identify, it's just other layers of things that, create individual experiences that are so important for us to talk about. I think at GHLF, one of the things that we really focus on is, healthcare for the Hispanic community. That's something that is needed by everyone. And the challenges there are also a different layer based on, financial income, based on literacy, based on language. So it creates different challenges for different people. Have you ever faced or know anyone that's ever faced challenges with accessing healthcare as a Hispanic American? And if so, can you describe what they were?
Yeah, medical neglect is rampant, unfortunately. Medical erasure is rampant also. Even in accessing mental health care, I have so many clients that come to me and say, "You're the first like Latina or brown therapist I've ever had." And when I worked with white therapists, I didn't feel like the advice they were giving me could like apply to my life, right? Or my specific experiences. Or just felt deeply misunderstood, right? So definitely, and it takes a lot to even want to share, right, about what you're experiencing. So that is really tough. Also, I've seen it a lot too with just language barriers. Somebody comes in, I worked at a psychiatric clinic. They would come in and maybe we didn't have any staff to translate for them. And so kids are translating or there's this piecemeal translation happening and they're getting subpar care, right? They're not getting the full time, the full information, and just being dismissed and erased. I do want to give one example of like medical neglect and cruelty that I know of and this is not uncommon, where a doctor was doing research in the Latinx community, and in that research was finding out different diagnoses that people had. And so when they asked, like, how are you going to share this? Like, what is the plan for us sharing this to the community? The doctor said, well, they don't understand and they can't afford care, so we're not going to share it. Right? So just complete neglect and erasure.
And I think that's just, it blows my mind because we know that there's so many physicians that really speak to our community and have a great bedside manner with patients. And then when you find a situation where someone can have that experience of, being othered, it just takes away, the, I think, trust that our community has within the medical healthcare system. It makes it challenging for those, other healthcare professionals that are very dedicated and engaged. So it is important for us to make sure that we find ways so that people can advocate for themselves when they go to the doctor's office, whether it's representation through a family member themselves, to just know that they have a right to be heard and to ask questions and to follow up, like the rest of us are. That is a right that they should have when they're getting medical care.
Absolutely. I love that, right? Push, ask questions, don't feel like you can't take up space, right?
Yes. Like my mom says, sin pelos en la lengua. So without, hair in your mouth, like no
Yes.
worry, like just let it come out however it does, but say something.
I love that. I do want to ask y'all some questions. So have y'all ever felt pressure to conform to certain stereotypes or stigmas within the Hispanic community? And how has that impacted your experiences?
Yeah, I'll go first.
I want to hear your answer. I was like, I want to hear this.
Yeah, so I grew up in a predominantly Mexican faith community, but something that really used to bother me was the feeling of having to make myself smaller as a woman, a submissive daughter, future wife. Most of my Hispanic peers were mostly focused on marriage and dating, and that's really never been me. Nobody prioritized education. And also when I say that most of my peers were Mexican or Hispanic, they were immigrants or their parents were immigrants. So, and many of them were undocumented. So they were very strongly rooted in their culture, their family of origin. And I am naturally defiant. And so at some point I just started feeling like I just don't fit in. And it contributed so much to feeling lonely. And also, I remember when I started dating, there was a family friend who asked me what my future name was going to be. And I was like, well, I don't know. I haven't really decided if I'm going to change it yet. And she said, well, that's how we do it in our culture. And I felt this like, oh, like I might have wanted to change my name, but now that you're saying that, I really don't want to. So I said, maybe in your culture, but not mine. But yeah, I'd say mostly that education and then just regular gender, the typical gender norms for women.
Well, I think for as you were saying that, I was like, I wonder if we would have some of the same things. And it did resonate when you were saying the last name is a big deal. And we've all kept Tapia.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, we're still fighting the resistance for some of those traditional norms. I think for me, really, it's also been coming to the United States. You know, the first place that we lived in was California, Los Angeles. And being in California, a lot of the Spanish speakers were Mexican. So our culture really quickly evolved into the Mexican culture, right?
Yeah.
So I can, make sancocho and tamales, like both are
Yeah.
Dishes that I feel are part of my, upbringing and our comfort foods and traditional. So one of the things that I struggled with definitely was my hair. It was something that I started, straightening my hair to kind of fit in with my other friends because they had very straight hair. And for years I was, putting chemicals in my hair to take the curl out, to straighten it, to flat iron it. But there were other things I couldn't change. My skin tone was darker, my nose was broader. A lot of it became image things that I felt I didn't fit into the norm of my environment. And when you're young, all you know is that. So I'm not thinking about the whole world and how family members that are in New York and Philadelphia and Miami are surrounded by other people that ethnically look more like them. For me, it was, being in a community where I looked very different, but we spoke the same language and we had the same challenges. And, we're all scared of the chancla. And
I mean, my mom did gentle parenting. So
that is, your mom was ahead of her time.
Yeah.
Very true. Very true. And then you had, outliers of family members that had different experiences and started making that shift. But for me, I think was some of those changes that were really visible to me identifying as an adolescent growing up.
Yeah, I can hear the internalized feeling that we all get of like something is wrong, right? We need to change something about us. And as that relates to mental health and the experiences that y'all just shared, how did that impact your mental health as an adolescent? And how was your experience affected by cultural mental health stigmas too, if your mental health was impacted?
I think for me, mental health was not a word that was spoken. I, now identify the cases of what was anxiety. That back then was, just seen as me complaining about something or just being a worrywart about something. So it wasn't a conversation that we had, but I do realize that feeling separated from identifying from someone else makes you feel so isolated. And then with that, you internalize a lot of questions and answers, and it creates this circle pattern where, of course, our thoughts are usually more negative than they should be. So it was, inserting the negative of what someone thought of me or how I did something, and then wondering if I can do that better or wondering how I can change that person's perception. And again, I think those were all things that now I recognize as, just anxiety thoughts that can circle unless I center myself. But back then it was, I felt like, well, I'm the problem and there's something abnormal about me. Because when I would ask questions, it was more of, don't worry about it, or, that's not something you need to be concerned about, or it's not a big deal, but there was never a follow through conversation.
Yeah. I think so. For me, I grew up in a family with mental illness. My mom was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 12, and we knew nothing about what that meant, how that was going to affect us, and whether or not our community would understand. And I remember even within family, there was so much And so within the Hispanic community, the idea is that we come to this country to work, and there's no time for depression, there's no time for laziness, and that's for white people, that's for Americans. We don't have the privilege of being mentally ill. But we, as her children, were so strongly affected by the impact of her having bipolar disorder. And we felt like we couldn't talk to anybody about it. Nobody understood. And not only that, but I was afraid of, we had more of a closed family system, so to speak. So I was afraid of reaching out for help, talking to counselors at school. I felt like nobody would understand. I couldn't trust anybody. And I'm also a middle child. And so I felt this extreme pressure to try and balance the emotional state of the household. And that ended up affecting me a lot emotionally and mentally. And so I developed this pattern of, I deal with my problems by myself. I can't talk to anybody. And also, it was normal for us to experience bouts of depression. So within our home, my mom would be in one room, my brother's in their room, myself in my own room, but we didn't even know how to have that discussion. It wasn't until she entered her 50s, I think, that we finally realized, okay, we know how to tackle this. We understand, we know how to balance it all, but it was all through our own personal research and not through any resources that we ever knew were available to us.
And that was definitely a family experience for all of us to realize, that this is something that it takes a village, and it takes being open to the conversation. And I think, the experience with my family was, if it's not talked about, no one's asking questions because you don't deal with someone else's home. But it's really different than what we are raised as, we build as a community. But somehow when it comes to, mental health, there are challenges there. So Samantha, have you had any experiences within your personal life with family regarding mental illness, or what was the driver for the type of work that you do?
Yes. Thank you for asking that. I think I relate to what y'all were sharing in terms of like your parents having to be in survival mode, right? You've just got to work, you've got to get along, you've got to get some financial stability, that there's not really a lot of space for emotions, right? And social exploration. And I grew up in poverty and moved around a ton, and lived in Section 8 and a shelter for a year and a half. And so because of that, there's a law in Texas where if you're homeless, you can go to any school in the city. And so my mom would always purposely send me to like affluent schools so that I could have access to a better education. But because of that, the other impact was that I felt very different, right? I felt it really impacted my self-esteem because I was not only poor, but I was also brown, and I spoke differently and lived differently than my peers. And so, my self-esteem took a hit. I felt very anxious. Lots of those thoughts that you shared, Angel, about, what do I need to change about myself to try to fit in? Something must be wrong with me. Can I be smart enough, right? All of those things. And same thing, no language to verbalize any of this, just feeling really alone and not good enough overall. And so also just like my home life, since I lived in poverty and my peers were also in poverty, seeing their struggles, which were very different than mine because they weren't going to the school I was going to, but they were also experiencing a bunch of trauma in their experience, and really caring about that at such a young age as well, definitely made me want to advocate for my community, share about these experiences, put language to right, everything that I would have wanted when I was younger.
And I think that is a driver, just by hearing your story, it makes so much sense now. Just, knowing more about you and the fact that, we have a drive because we do want to share that our stories are different. We make up such a large community, and we have so many similarities that are beautiful, right? Our food and our language, and some of the ways that our grandmas behave, or that our family order affects the way that we show up within our family. But then there are those layers that make us different. And those experiences can be, being documented, being undocumented, being a resident, being a citizen, living in Miami, living in Los Angeles. Like, all of those things can make a person who identifies as a Hispanic, female, a Latina, show up in a different way just because of the city we live in, just because of the immigration status, because of the skin tone that we have, that and just varies by different shades. And I think that because of it, it is important to make sure that we are, as you said, advocating for ourselves, right? Telling people what are the differences that we have, along with what are the similarities that we have. We don't just fit one box, and yet we have to check one box. But I think anytime that we have to do that, we're like, I'm checking this box, but I know, like, I need this line next to it so that I can really break down. Yes. And to have an opportunity to say, and these are my others. And this is why I am multifaceted. And I feel that we all share in that when we start looking at our stories, looking at those around us, and trying to, again, identify with each other for that bigger picture. But then when you go inward, to realize that we are representing different generations, different cultures, and just overall a different experience.
Yeah. Also, according to postmodern therapy styles, our reality is shaped by our interactions with others. So you can fall within the box of being a Latinx or Hispanic, but ultimately the interactions that you have on a daily basis are what end up shaping what you consider your reality. So everyone is going to have a completely different perspective and a very nuanced experience.
Very good point.
Yeah, it's really important to underscore that. I think you're totally right, because it almost will feel invalidating, and like parts of us are not able to be seen, right? When we have to just say, I'm Latinx, right? And it's like, oh, well, that doesn't exude like my connection to my ancestors, right? That doesn't depict my connection to my home country. That doesn't pick the neighborhood that I'm from, right? So all of those things are really important to us. I think that's a value that we share in our community, of like, we want to be seen in all of those nuances and complexities. And so that is part of our identity and the language that we use to identify ourselves. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you all a question. So Angel, I'll ask you first. Have you experienced discrimination because of your Hispanic heritage? And if so, can you share about those experiences?
So I think of the word discrimination as, in my mind, a very specific experience of someone making a prejudgment and not allowing someone to do something or have a certain opportunity. And I think the most impactful for me was when I was young, arriving in the United States, going to school and being put, in a classroom where everyone's speaking English. I had no idea what anyone was talking about. And I think it was like a couple of months in that they put me in special education because they thought I had a learning disability. There was not a conversation to figure out that the challenges I was having were language based. No one noticed that I wasn't talking to anyone at recess, or that I was eating lunch by myself, like all of the things that I was doing because, the children who spoke Spanish didn't think I spoke Spanish, so they weren't talking to me. And then the children who thought I spoke English to me, and I didn't know what they were saying. So it created just a distancing for me, and I am not allowed to engage in the conversation that the classroom's having or answer the teacher's question. And it was that feeling of being kind of left behind, because then I was in special education and I wasn't getting the education that I needed, because they weren't addressing the challenge that I was having. And it took almost a year in special ed. And by that time, my brother,
My dad.
yes, had enough English that he went with my mom to the school and they had conversations and started figuring out like she, reads and writes and does everything in Spanish very well. And it was one of those moments where ultimately I had to repeat the year, but they put me in ESL. And then I flourished and I realized an apple is a manzana,
Wow.
and you make that link and connection.
Yeah.
But there was that feeling of discrimination because I was categorized by the way I looked, and no one bothered to ask questions, to know me and realize I didn't fit into the box that you assume by the way that I look, and you prejudged what my ethnicity, race, and culture is based on a idea. So I think to me, it was something that was unintentional in a way, but definitely it was a prejudice and discrimination.
Wow. I actually didn't know that. Wow. I'm sorry you went through that.
It was a very life-shaping experience, but I wouldn't change it. I think,
Yeah.
hey, it's really helped though, because by the time I finished that class, I was just like whizzing
Right.
through ESL. Like, listen,
Wow.
I've almost spent a year hearing all this stuff. I know I'm just linking these things.
Wow. So as for me, I can only think of one time where I felt that I experienced discrimination directly like that, which was, again, I went to a predominantly white school, and there was a girl who was an immigrant from Mexico, and she felt more comfortable speaking in Spanish. And so I would spend time with her during our classes, and I would speak to her in Spanish. And one day, this boy who was this popular guy, I think he might have been on the football team or something. This was in middle school. He walks by and he looks at me and he's like, "Oh, can you get your dad to come mow my lawn?" I was just so shocked and very uncomfortable. And everybody laughed. And I just felt like, wow, okay. And also, growing up in California, we did go to a predominantly Mexican school. And so I was used to the beauty standards of that culture. And then I moved here and everybody was so skinny. And I remember one day I was walking in the hallway and this guy had, I think it was like a trumpet or something. And mind you, I was fairly thin, just not as skinny as the white kids in class. I developed at a very young age. And so I definitely was like 13, 14 and very curvy. And this guy was walking behind me with like a trumpet or trombone, I don't know, some kind of horn instrument. And as I stepped, he was making like sounds for each step. And then I became anorexic. um, and then I remember in high school, although I didn't have direct experiences like that, I just remember hearing conversations about Hispanics with people not knowing that I was a Hispanic, or conversations about welfare and debates that they would make us have in school, and people talking about how immigrants are lazy and saying things like that. And I'm just sitting there and absorbing all of this information, and it felt so bad. And I remember one day in school, I was at the time, because of the recession and because of my mom's mental illness, my dad was working, but obviously wasn't able to bring in as much. He had to spend most of our savings to just like work through the recession. And so at the time we were on Medicaid and food stamps. And I remember kids going into debates about this in school and saying things like, "Oh, they should just get jobs at McDonald's. Like, why are they trying to steal our tax money?" and things like that. And I remember one day in class, I got so angry and I said something, I basically expressed my experience without saying that it was mine. And I said, "Okay, what about in a family of 5 where a wife was diagnosed with mental illness and she's not able to work and the dad has to give up his job and they moved to this state?" And I started explaining all of it. And then I said, "So you don't think, you think these people should starve instead? You think these people just shouldn't have access to healthcare?" And then nobody said anything. And I think that was the last time I remember hearing conversations like that, because probably the word spread in school and people realized like, okay, can't really talk like that around her. But yeah, those were my experiences.
And Samantha, what have been your experiences? Have you, or family members, I'm sure, with those that you counsel, any of those prejudices or discrimination experiences that have been impactful?
Yeah. I'm a therapist. So I'm kind of also just sitting with what y'all shared, because those are really huge instances of prejudice. And I know the way that impacts our neurobiology and our nervous system, and having to get in that fight mode, right? Where you have to advocate, Felicia, like you did, which was just so bold and beautiful. But a lot of people in our community can't, right? We'll shrink, right? We'll kind of go in. And yeah, I experienced it recently, maybe a year or two ago here in Austin. We were talking, I was with some friends and we were talking about the local elections at our table, and we saw a group of women that were kind of close, and I was like, oh, I wonder if we should invite them to have the conversation with us. And it was all white women. And we were a group of Black and brown people. And so I go over to their table, and they don't even look at me. They're all just kind of looking at their menu. And then they're just like, I was like, hey, how's it going? And then they were just like, oh, we're not ready to eat yet. We don't know what we want. And so it's just like, okay. So yeah, a lot of things like that where it's just kind of in the air, right? It's in the media, it's on the news, right? That we are as valuable as our work, right? That is our worth is our work, right? We are in these positions, we're servers, we're housekeepers, we're doing landscaping. And that unfortunately is in the messaging all around. And so, yeah, I think that was illuminated in y'all's experiences too.
And there is that sense where I think it's, empowering to, in those moments, have a teachable moment, right? Where, we don't all look and sound a certain way, and the expectation or vision that someone may have of what a Hispanic, Latinx person, Afro-Latina, what is that specifically? And I think it is just the openness of, asking the questions, not making the assumptions, right? I do that when I go to Target. I don't just ask a person with a red shirt on, where can I find this? I realize that I need to make sure I'm looking for a name tag, and then I can ask for help. So I think that there are ways and safe spaces, which we need to be creating, where we take the opportunity to educate people, whether it be, in a classroom, in a therapy session, or, on a podcast. Like, I think those are all beautiful ways for us to share these stories.
Yeah. Oh, I have a question for you. So, as someone who understood and spoke English more than your parents at a certain point, because of course you did have to learn the language and all, do you feel like you experienced any kind of like parentified roles, meaning where you had to assume more of an adult-like role to take care of things for your parents?
Yes. But I think the interesting thing is, when you go through it, you don't realize it until you get older, or you talk to people who don't have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I was translating very, very early on, and things I didn't understand. I mean, I knew the words, right? But I don't know, loan document, or, this medical exam result, or this bill that came in the mail. So I would just tell them what it said, but didn't have really a concept even of what I was saying. And then there's that fear of, am I going to get in trouble if I'm not saying the right thing? So I think that those are things that definitely I experienced, and were challenges in having to be the person responsible to, I guess it felt like, making decisions for adults. And I knew I shouldn't be. So I did struggle with that, but it was a reality. And I do now feel that it's a blessing, because it's the reason why I have the drive to do this work, and knowing the importance of educating people about our culture, making sure that we're creating accessible information that is in Spanish, because I know from my parents, from aunts and uncles, the importance of having those resources, and the burden that it takes off of those children and family members that do have to be translators.
Yeah, I didn't learn this until much later that growing up too fast is a sign of trauma. So having to do that for your parents makes you have to step out of your child mode, be a grown up. And it's interesting because so many people that we meet on an everyday basis kind of gives you, it's like sometimes you can meet people that give you that energy and they can be so comforting and cool. And then you end up finding out, oh, this person experienced some sort of a parentified role and that's why they're so mature, you know?
Mhm.
But yeah, that's a very interesting experience.
And Samantha, talking about the trauma that sometimes comes with that in parentification experiences, is that something that you've heard a lot about just from those that you counsel?
Yeah, absolutely. Like what you're talking about, having to um, kind of step in. I'm thinking about clients where their parents would own a business, right? And so then the kids are the ones negotiating the price and explaining the rules, right, of the store or the product. And you're totally right, Felicia. That is definitely like a parentified role, and it's not fair for our little brains and bodies to have to step into that role, right? Angel, you're talking about you don't know what you're even translating. You don't even know what these words mean, right? You're having to translate medical jargon, legal jargon, but you just have to say it. And then sometimes the parents can be stressed out because they're asking you, well, what does that mean? And you're like, I don't actually know. I just know these words, right? And so just such a stressful experience that puts us in fight or flight, that gets our adrenaline up, gets our cortisol up at such a young age, which really weathers on our body. So yeah, it's an important conversation. Yeah. Speaking of parents, and them having to come over here, right? Or maybe make sacrifices for their children, or even for you guys in your direct experience. Have either of you felt pressured to build a legacy or to be successful in a certain way, in an American way, because of the sacrifices that your parents did make for you and the life that they wanted for you and your family?
I want to hear your answer.
Okay.
I am learning a lot.
Yeah, same. I definitely do. I am a really sensitive person and I feel a strong connection to my family. And when I think of the history and all of the things that must have occurred for me to even exist, I just feel like, okay, this can't be for nothing. All of the sacrifices, all of the love or the pain that had to happen for me to come into existence, I want to do something about it. I feel this, especially when I see my parents and their struggles, or my dad and how hard he's worked to help support me through school. I just feel this immense amount of pressure to be more than what be more than the limitations that my parents had or that their parents had. And I'm grateful that I already see that happening. I'm the first of my household to graduate from college and the first, well, to have a bachelor's degree and the first to be in grad school. And I don't want to stop there. I want to continue to educate myself and help educate others. And I want to contribute to the healing energy of this world so that I can feel like all of the sacrifices that my ancestors made were worth it.
And I felt like that was going to be your answer only because, I mean, my parents have made it very clear that they brought us here for a reason and a purpose. And that's something that was a very direct conversation, right? Where it's like, you are expected to do more than, and I mean, it's very specific of more than us because we did not speak the language and you have these advantages. And I think for me, that was the drive to continue with education. And that was the drive to make sure that the decisions I made affected like the collective family.
Yeah.
So some of the choices that I made were for myself. And then I think the decisions that I made to excel were made more for the bigger picture and the pressure and the expectation. And I think that that's something that the older generation feels is sometimes, lost as we get to the next generations because there isn't the well, I didn't know the language. It was difficult for me. Like, I cannot have that argument. Yeah, I can have that argument with my children because I was an immigrant. I, became a citizen and had to go through a process where they have been given this opportunity. And I don't know how precious people see it unless they've gone through the challenges.
Right.
And I am afraid that as we get further into our family generations, that's something that is erased, that our language might be erased, that our culture might be erased, because, my mom is very traditional, but I am not like her. So when I'm a grandmother, there's things that will be lost in that.
Right.
And then you continue moving forward generations. And I think that the drive and the responsibility for family is something that can be lost. And I think that would be something that changes our culture because it's such a strong part of it as
For
well.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting point because we can talk about how our origin contributed to a lot of our hardships or a lot of our trauma, but then there's still this deep appreciation for our roots. And I totally agree with you because I think even my cousins and my siblings, I don't think that they feel the same way that I do. I think that I just feel this way because I am so sensitive. And also as a middle child, feeling the need to maintain balance and to keep the family together. I think just, yeah.
And Samantha, is that something that those that you see and speak to express as a real pressure, even through different generations, or is that something that kind of falls off after you get into second and third generation?
I think it's different the later into how long you've been into this country, but I think it's still there because even in American culture, right, it's a lot of capitalism, it's a lot of work really hard, and so I think that for people that their parents have made a ton of sacrifices, right, and there's been a lot of trauma in trying to get here to get more opportunity. That's a lot of pressure on you too, right? Or anybody in that situation. That is a lot of pressure to have on you, even though it does sometimes lead you to flourish and thrive and be fierce and amazing human beings, right? There is a dark side to that where you don't know how to rest, right? That's something I hear a lot too of like, I don't know how to sit with myself. I feel like I must always do something. I must always prove my value. And so trying to fine tune that balance and know that you deserve ease and joy as well, even though these sacrifices were made. And talking about the richness of the culture, that's something we also bring into the therapy space of like, yeah, can we harness those sacrifices from our ancestors, that resilience, that drive, right? We have that power. How do we harness that? How do we embody that and feel that and really fuel us from that space versus the space of like, I need like a deficit, like I need to prove I'm worthy, I prove it all means something, right? And just like getting into those nuances a little bit.
And in your experience, what are ways that, just within, I mean, I feel that this has been very insightful and kind of eye opening just in the experiences, like I said, that we could have within a family, the similarities in the way that we look, but the differences in the ways that we look are also, creating different levels of experience. But what are ways that, or tips that you can give to those that need to or want to have this conversation with family and friends about how to open up and share some of these experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so important. I think young people are doing such a great job sharing, right? Just like talking to parents of like, can I share this story or can I share like what my experience is like? And also gathering theirs. Y'all were talking about not wanting to lose certain things of the culture of y'all's stories, right? Of your ancestors' stories. Also, it being a mutual thing of like, hey, mom, I want to hear your story and I want to record it and I want to document it because a lot of times these things are lost. And then also, can I share about my experience and like what things are like now and how things are transforming and just directly asking and saying like, that's important to me, right? Like I care about our history. I think it's great too that people are showing up on social media and sharing the nuances of experiences, right? Our conversation has illuminated how different it could be, even though we share being brown. Taking up space, yeah, just knowing that your specific story is important and different and could help other people to learn, right?
I like what you mentioned about the importance of documenting things so that the stories aren't lost. I think that I would love to do that with our family.
They like to talk.
They do.
We can get a couple of stories out of grandma and grandpa.
We say they like to talk.
Yes. It's a Hispanic
Yeah,
Latino thing. Everyone's related.
Yeah, ready to talk.
Yes. And now having the very important and needed conversations, which I think is a beautiful thing. So with that, I want to thank you for taking time to be a part of this and to, be vulnerable and share your stories, and know that what you're sharing, others are relating with. And also it's opening conversations that, I think generations need to have within families. So I appreciate you for taking this explorative journey with me.
Yeah.
And I hope that it's a way that we continue having these conversations. And as Samantha said, document it. And Samantha, thank you so much for being a part of this. Your insight has been very helpful. It's created and stirred up just reminders, memories, things that I think I've healed from, things that I think are still important to talk about. Stories that sometimes we haven't shared within our own families that, can create trauma or that can be inspiring. And I think the experience that you bring with your stories, with the work that you do is really healing to the community. And it also brings awareness to those that may not know about the experience. We don't just want it to be something that people focus on for Hispanic Heritage Month. We want it to be a conversation that's ongoing because we are a part of this culture, of this community, of this world. And we need to be able to have the conversations to better educate those that don't know the nuances and the richness of our diversities, but also within our family units to keep that conversation and bond so that, we have generations of those that are proud to be Hispanic, proud to be Latinx, proud to be Afro-Latinos, and everything in between.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for y'all. Thanks for letting me be a part of just y'all's family story, right? Y'all's family conversation and everything you shared, and also just initiating this conversation because, yeah, like you said, it is so important. It's so healing for us and then for everybody that's listening that can really identify with a lot of the things that we've talked about. Thank y'all so much.
Also, I loved your experience, Samantha. I want to hear more about your background later.
I figured I would feel the same about y'all. I'm like, oh, I'm going to get to hear, like, I'm going to want to be friends for sure.
Yes, likewise.
Yeah. We'll have the part 2 continuation because there's always things to dive into for sure.
Absolutely. I'd love it.
We hope this conversation sparks an intimate conversation with you and your family about the experiences that you have as Hispanic, Latinx, or those that are outside of our culture that are interested to learn more. We are going to have more interviews and content to share this message en voz alta, so stay tuned.